our podcast.
So, Dicky, I'd like to start with you in terms of your involvement with VECINA. You mentioned how gratifying it can be to work on behalf of somebody who really needs the help of a lawyer and to be able to get, make some positive change for somebody. Did you realize that that was something that was possible when you first started working for VECINA? Is that something you sort of understood later on after getting into the work? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got drawn to this work and sort of what it means to you now?
Well, I was hoping, that it would be something, rewarding and meaningful when I volunteered with VECINA, but it has been so much more than that, for me, and being able to help people. Let me give you one example. I represented through VECINA a man who was a seaman in Venezuela, and the government ordered him to unload a bunch of petroleum for the government, and he refused. He said, "It's not yours. If my employer tells me to, I will." So they put him on a traitor list, and he had to flee. And after about a 2-year fight, we were able to get Ronaldo, this man, asylum. And here's what he sent me after we won his asylum case. "I faced extreme situations on the ocean, and afterwards I could see a rainbow on the horizon. The last 2 years, I've been living in a storm without being able to see that rainbow on the horizon. But thanks to you, I now see it again." I mean, that made the whole 2 years worth
Maybe that goes on your obit.
it. Tombstone.
Tombstone. All right. Well, we'll have to get an extra big tombstone. I mean, that's a lot of words. I don't know if we can afford that, Dicky.
But
So,
no, I was going to say, it has been so rewarding, to be able, to help people. And they're so thankful because, without you volunteering, they would have no help.
we've talked a little bit about the challenges from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Maria Laura, if you could give us a little idea of why Texas is such an important testing ground for immigration policy, and if there's something you think is happening in Texas that the rest of the country should understand as it relates to these types of cases.
So early on in the administration's ascension to power, we understood that Texas was likely going to be a battleground for policies and maybe innovative practices within immigration that would then be applied elsewhere around the country. Texas sits at the intersection of immigration policy, state policy, detention infrastructure, and just border enforcement, plus the Fifth Circuit that Dicky mentioned earlier. And I think it's important to understand some of the context of how well the immigration machine under the Trump administration works here. 1 in 4 people detained in ICE are in Texas. Texas holds more detainees, currently over 16,000 people, than any other state in the country. And, I think it's also important to understand that this policy between law enforcement and ICE and detention is really functioning very well in Texas, and even in how it connects with law enforcement in the fact that 52% of Texas ICE arrests actually originate in the local jails here, in Travis County specifically. So I think it's important to understand that the practices that function here, to the extent that there isn't pushback, they will continue to unfortunately detain more and more individuals who followed due process, who in fact, many of them were invited here, like many of our Afghan families who we still work with. And so what I look at with Texas is that the pieces and practices in place here, I start to see them replicated in other places. Most recently, we're seeing some of the practices around reunification with families who are reunited through ORR reunification process. Once they're reunited, we're seeing them redetained here in Texas. And we've started to hear that the similar pieces are happening in California. So again, some of the trends we see here start to spread elsewhere. And I think it is an important state to keep an eye on right now.
You mentioned reunification, and lots of us out here don't have, we hear these terms, they sort of roll by us. We think we generally understand what they mean, but I suspect we don't fully understand what they mean. when you use the word reunification, what is that referring to specifically?
Yeah. We have a program that I'm referring to specifically about reuniting children who've either crossed the border on their own and are part of the ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement custody, and are here to reunite with loved ones. Or it can also be children who are separated due to internal enforcement. So mom and dad goes to work, somebody's detained, child is now a part of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and is in what's called custody of. They're generally placed in foster homes and or you can have shelters that are specifically designated and working with ORR to house these children. When I speak of reunification, our work at VECINA is pretty unique because we're one of the few that does this work. We support the sponsors, meaning the parents, caregivers, it could be aunts, uncles who are trying to reunify with the child in the reunification process. Historically, that process was pretty short, meaning families could reunite within a month. Now you're looking at one of our recent cases, a child was in OR custody for over 500 days, and it required actually a habeas petition to release the child. So when I talk about reunification, I talk about that process that is currently under Office of Refugee Resettlement. And similar to the things we've been talking about with Asylum, Craig, the adversarial context is also very much playing in that system so that children are in detention longer. They're being moved regularly. And now we're seeing the loss of legal support for the children as a result of some of the federal funding changes that just happened, where a lot of our partner sister organizations who provide legal orientation support for these children and legal support in court just lost their funding. And that funding is still very much in play. And so now you've got a whole host of kiddos who no longer can go through this very complex immigration process with any kind of legal support. So imagine what that could look like, whether it's a 6-year-old child to a 12-year-old child going through the immigration process alone. And then our angle, VECINA's angle, is to try and reunify that adult caregiver as quickly as possible. One of the reasons that's important right now in Texas specifically is because we started to see some of the changes that have now spread across the country here, where, for example, laws were changed around how a sponsor needed to come forward with their own identification. Now, if you're an undocumented immigrant in, let's say, California or New York, you are still able to apply for actual state verified identification. But in the case of places like Texas or Louisiana, that's not the case. And so folks with some new laws that were put in place could not even come forward without exposing themselves to the immigration machine that is, while they're trying to reunify with loved ones and do the right thing by taking in their families, and instead have been seeing their children in detention for indefinite periods of time. To me, the work that we do at VECINA is really intense, but the work with the children, and I know Dicky's been a part of that, is particularly intense because you're seeing the way that this system is tearing families apart in real time and how much harder it can be to try to just reunify them in a space that's safe and that's caring, where they have access to food and water and not in detention. So that's what I mean when I say reunification specifically.
What does detention look like for people, for an adult versus a child who's in immigration detention? Does it look like jail?
For children, if they're in ORR custody, it does not, in the sense that they are at a home and they can be secured homes with different levels of access to the outside world. So I would still consider it a type of detention, but it does not look like what we know to be detention centers. That being said, we have a place called Dilley here in Texas, which since it was reopened in March of 2025, has seen thousands of families go through. And that in and of itself is a terrible place with documented issues of access to food, access to water, access to medicine. It's a detention center. And I know Dicky's also had some experience with Dilly himself.
And I want to ask Dicky about that, but Dicky, before I do, because it feels to me like there's sometimes a disconnect with what we read in the media versus the reality. So as it relates to folks being in detention, is it the case, this is a question back to you, Maria Laura, about those folks, that there's a bunch of people that are in these detention facilities that are like a jail that have basically been following the rules, but suddenly the government decided they wanted to change the rules. Is that
That is
correct?
100% accurate.
You
Yes.
bet. You know,
There,
well, I was just going to say about Dilley. Uh, it's the government has named it the South Texas Residential Facility, but it's a prison with pretty murals, is all it is. And these prisons are real money makers because they're all run by private entities. And obviously, they're interested in the bottom line. And the food that these people get is not good. They're supposed to be educating children that are there because I mean, I've represented little girls that are 10, 11 years old, and they're supposed to be going to school, and they're not. And so it's just a terrible situation. And when you're talking about, Marie was talking about reunification, some of the cases that I've had through VECINA, the parents didn't even know where their children were. We had to find where their children were. And all of us as parents, can you imagine, how frightening that is to not even know, where your child is. And then now, because of the laws that have changed, it's more difficult because the government's using a child to sort of, like we saw with the little boy and the Spider-Man backpack, using children to try to entrap parents. So it's just a totally horrible situation.
When all of this change to the immigration system happened, there was the talking point from the government was that, this was to try and get people out of the country who were committing crimes, and that somehow this would make us safer. Is there what Maria, Laura, maybe you can start by telling us what is the reality there? Is that the case? Or is it something different in terms of the practical effect of who these folks are that are ending up in detention centers and that the government is trying to deport?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is not the case. Of course, this was sold to the American public at a time when folks could agree with wanting to get immigrants who have committed certain crimes out of the country. And while I think that is something one can get behind, what ends up happening now is that the majority of people in detention, I think it's up to 70%, aren't by no means have any kind of criminal background whatsoever. And so the policy change and the actuality are not in line, are not in two step. And also, I'll highlight that I actually think I'll give a lot of credit to the American public that I think people are very much aware now more than they were even, last year, that this isn't right. And the sentiment on immigration across parties is not positive in the way that it's being handled. And so I would say that the notion of kind of otherizing and putting a policy in place to then accentuate it to a whole nother level is backfiring to some extent. And also the fact that many of the folks that are in detention are some of the hardest working, some of the kind of fabric of our community. My family is an immigrant. We came here in 1990. I can't imagine what our lives would be like were it not for the gifts that this country has provided to us to rebuild a new life. And so for me, I can see that, this follow the law is no longer a real statement because there is no way to follow the law at this point. And so I just think it's in the long run, I very much think that things will head in the opposite direction and that people will start to see that this was wrong. And this is going to be an interesting time in the history of the United States, but mostly the fact that we finally have net migration in the United States for the first time in a long time is going to have repercussions across every level. So that could be, of course, community, fabric, education, who makes the United States as a country and the fabric of the country, but also the economics of it. There's just a lot of ramifications to these policies that have played out, and we'll see kind of how it moves forward. But I'm optimistic that people will see that this was not the right way to do it. And my hope is for immigration reform, period. that is the future, and I'm hopeful that this will be the catalyst that gets us there.
Yeah, it seems incredibly sad that there actually was a reform bill on the table that could have happened in the last administration that at least would have provided, no matter what your opinions are, at least there could be some rules that everybody can agree on, whereas now it feels a little bit like the Wild West. Maria Laura, to your point, it's we're all a product of our own history. And when I was hearing this talk about how uh, the administration was going to get rid of criminals, I couldn't help but think, because of my own history of a decade and a half being a public defender, I wasn't sure who those people were. Because every time I had a client who wasn't here legally and they pled even sometimes to just a misdemeanor, they were deported. They got deported. And certainly anybody with a felony got deported. So I was always curious, well, who are these people that the administration is talking about? Because as far as I can tell, and this is in California, this isn't in a place like, Texas or someplace that's even more aggravated about this issue, right? This is just California. This is in San Francisco, a place that people don't typically think of as, a place that might be deporting folks who are not here with the proper documentation. So, Dicky, from a legal standpoint, you've now handled a number of these cases. The legal work's important, but it seems to me there's a piece here where we need to tie our legal work to the PR piece to help drive home this point that Maria Laura just told us about, which is to get the public, those who still don't realize what's going on, what in fact is going on. Is that something that you have done in any of the cases you've worked on?
Uh, we've really tried to, and something that's interesting because, basically ICE has a quota and they're going for low-hanging fruit. It's a lot easier to represent a mother when she's taking her child to school, or, as Maria mentioned earlier, complying with the rules and going to your appointment. You have to check in with ICE every few months. Well, they can grab you there. And so it's really uh, a lot easier now, instead of trying to get a criminal to, basically, uh, get somebody that, a poor mother and a poor child. I think that, as Maria's saying, it's dawning on people because they're picking up maybe their yard man or their maid or somebody that's been here a long time, or they're now picking up, people that are here legally. And I know with my granddaughter's help, because I can't really do Facebook, we put something in about a woman and her 11-year-old child that we were able to get out of Delhi. And I got all kind of responses from Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals about just this topic. Well, I thought we were only getting criminals. And I think when the public realizes, no, we're sort of past that. What we're doing now is arresting law-abiding, citizens. And that when that word gets out, I think hopefully it'll change because most Americans are not for that, whether they're a Republican, a Democrat, liberal, conservative, whatever. They're not for taking people that are law-abiding, trying to make a living for their family and contribute, to our society. They're not for taking them up and deporting them.
What about this idea that when the government is detaining these folks and then ultimately deports them, that they deport them to a place that they have zero connection to? How could that possibly be legal?
Well, basically, that has happened. Normally, when somebody's deported, they go back to their home country. Well, if they had to flee for political reasons, it's a death sentence. Others, they're sending to like Africa or places, where they have no connection whatsoever. And basically, so far, the courts have said, well, that's a executive department decision, it's not a legal decision, and they haven't interfered with it. But I mean, it's just horrible. what they're doing to people.
The Supreme Court of the United States has upheld deporting people from the United States to a country to which they have no connection.
Yes.
Okay.
And an example early on, there was the case of the man whose name escapes me, his last name was Garcia, that they sent to El Salvador.
Yeah.
And the court didn't say they couldn't send him to El Salvador. They said, well, wait, you need to give him due process before you send him somewhere. But what people maybe don't understand so much, in asylum cases, these aren't people that came to America to try to make a better living. They're people like my client Ronaldo that, had to flee. They had to get out of a country. Well, sending him back would be a death warrant. And so, it's really a difficult, situation that these people find themselves in. And to think all they've done here is come here, they've worked, supported their family, they've obeyed the law. You were talking about you get a misdemeanor and get deported. Sort of up for a comparison, I've never represented a detainee that was convicted of 45 felonies like some of our politicians.
An excellent point. And yet, feels like we need a whole nother episode on just how we got here. This all feels so anti-person, anti-family. It feels impossible that you could have a number of agencies and government entities working together collaboratively to promote an anti-person, anti-family scenario, that the one that you are all seeing play out. And so maybe we just need to save that for another day, but I can't help but think, how did we get here? So maybe instead of doing that today, we'll do that in another episode. And maybe you can tell us, for those of us who hear this and want to cry, how do we instead take that energy and turn it into something good to help people? What's the path?
There's a lot that can be done. There's so much that can be done, and maybe that is the hope that kind of is the through line for all of this. But for our work specifically, we need more attorneys. There are just not enough attorneys to handle the case, and there certainly are not enough immigration attorneys writ large to handle the cases across the country. So for our work, we would love to have folks that are experienced, for example, with habeas. Any experienced litigator can be incredibly valuable in just any of these detention cases, or even some of the reunifications I've mentioned, which are now inherently moving towards habeas almost in all of them. For the work that I mentioned with reunification, which is now called Family Integrity Project, we need attorneys to basically represent the sponsors. It's not an immigration process. It's a very challenging process because you're having to work directly with the federal government, Office of Refugee Resettlement, to connect with your child. So we need attorneys to help with that process. We need anyone that happens to have a family law expertise. We're now doing a lot more know your rights and family preparedness. So folks that can come in and say, here's what power of attorney looks like. Here's just some preventative things to think about in case of your next ICE appointment, X, Y, or Z could happen. And also I'll highlight, accompaniment is a really big piece to the work kind of across the board. When our families have the success of reunifying, we really try to find local support to just witness that process in case anything arises that we would then need to be involved in, post reunification. And we've even had some fellows, Ed Zerbersky and Debbie, who showed up when one of our most impactful long-term cases reunified after many years apart. And they were there, IATL fellows were there to make sure that the family had the support that they needed on the spot. And so there's so many different ways to engage. And there's also just training videos. I'll just put a plug in about our teachable videos. We've had, I think, 9,000 people at this point. If you're wanting to learn about this process and you're not quite sure you want to get in, teachable.org, teachable.com, excuse me, VECINA is available. And, most of our courses are free of charge. If not, they're, I think, a 25 nominal charge for folks. Habeas is one of our most popular because we have a lot of immigration attorneys that are not experienced with habeas work and are not federal litigators that are now having to do the work. So that's available. There's so much to do, and there's also just the community support. I mean, I'll say that attorneys are incredibly helpful, but as are folks that just say, what's happening in my neighborhood? What are my neighbors needing? And are showing up with each other for basic things like, taking people to a doctor's appointment because it's scary to drive alone, or as I mentioned earlier, access to food. Folks, we're seeing a lot of GoFundMe happening for folks where the main breadwinner will be detained, and then now you have an entire family that's trying to scramble to make rent. There's a lot of different ways in which people can get involved.
Dicky, what would you tell an attorney who worries that they don't have the right kind of experience, some of the experience that Maria Laura talked about that is helpful in these cases?
Well, it's like I was nervous, or I could just, I guess, out and out scared when I first volunteered because I didn't know anything about immigration law. And I still don't know it ins and outs. But VECINA, one, had training that I went through that Maria was talking about, but then also a mentor. And so when anything came up that I wasn't sure about, I went to my mentor. I can handle the trial stuff, but as far as the technicalities, and VECINA will give you both. And I think something that's really could help, in some of these bigger firms, especially, you have an associate who is board certified and objecting to interrogatories. Well, you can give this young man or this young woman something really meaningful to do, and something that they would really could get involved in, and would love to do. They're helping another human being. And like we said, we got the training and a mentor to help them. But and of course you need to be in Texas if you're going to file a habeas in at Dilley. But there's briefing that needs to be done. They're writing the habeas petition, and then things that come fit right in to being a trial lawyer, prepping witnesses, prepping these people for hearings and all. And I don't speak Spanish, barely speak English, but they get you interpreters. VECINA has translators for me. And it has been such a meaningful experience. And so I think for all trial lawyers, but especially, younger associates that are trying to get some experience and, maybe even a chance to, appear in court. So, it's really a golden opportunity for trial lawyers and wannabe trial lawyers, who are just starting out.
Maria Laura, if we've got listeners out there who have an active trial practice, they want to get involved, they want to help, is there one place that they can go, or what would be your advice as to how they get involved to do the most meaningful kind of work and the most important work that VECINA is looking for these types of cases?
There's our website, which is vecina.org, which actually has a whole section on the different projects we have running, and you can reach out to us that way. You can easily reach out to me, really easy, maria@vecina.org. I really love when I hear directly from folks who are just raising their hand saying, how can I engage? It allows me to maybe meet with them and get a good sense of where they're wanting to be, and then see if there's placement for cases. But I would say our website has a lot of information on active programs and ways to contact us as well, or myself directly.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. Thanks to our guests, to Maria Laura and to Dicky for being with us today and for sharing with us the important work that's being done to protect asylum seekers and those who are just trying to follow the law here in our U.S. system as it relates to immigration. It's difficult work, and we can't thank you enough. I will say that for those of us listening who are moved by this, don't cry. Go to the VECINA's website, send an email to Maria Laura, get involved to help these folks who so desperately need lawyers who can be the last line of defense. Please listen to our podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to having you join us on our next episode. Thanks very much.